Power doesn't announce itself with a gunshot. It whispers from the drape of a tailored suit. Tae-young Lee stood perfectly still on a low velvet pedestal, the air heavy with the scent of cedarwood and hot steam, as an elderly tailor carefully pinned the hem of his charcoal wool trousers. To the financial district buzzing 50 stories below, he was the meticulous CEO of Nebla's Logistics, a self-made billionaire with a pristine portfolio. To the underworld, he was an untouchable ghost. Long ago, Lee had scrubbed the blood from his knuckles, trading the brutal life of a street-level enforcer for the quiet devastation of offshore algorithms. He had learned the ultimate truth of the city. Thugs die young in the gutters, but accountants rule the world. His sanctuary of mahogany and quiet money was supposed to be impenetrable, an electronically sealed vault. Yet a soft thud against the reinforced glass drew Lee's sharp, dark eyes toward the street. Standing on the other side, oblivious to the freezing drizzle, was a 10-year-old girl dark-skinned. Her bright yellow sneakers were scuffed, and her small frame was swallowed by a faded, oversized jacket. She didn't look lost. She wasn't crying. Instead, she possessed a chilling, unshakable stoicism that felt entirely out of place on a child. One of the 3 armed security contractors blending into the shop's shadows stepped forward to wave her off, but the girl simply raised a hand and pressed a small plastic rectangle against the glass. It was a biometric thumb drive. Lee's gaze narrowed. He recognized the distinct casing immediately. It was the proprietary hardware of the Golden Lotus, the ruthless, old-school syndicate currently bleeding his shipping lanes dry through brute force and intimidation. With a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist, Lee signaled his guards. The heavy electronic locks clicked open. She stepped inside, her sneakers squeaking softly on the pristine hardwood, completely unfazed by the armed men looming over her. She marched straight to the edge of the velvet pedestal, looking up at the towering CEO not with a plea for charity, but with the cold calculation of someone offering a transaction. Orphaned at 6 and raised in the cramped back room of an East End electronics shop, Ayanna Davis hadn't grown up playing with dolls. Under the desperate, loving guidance of her older brother, Marcus, she had been raised on motherboards and complex lines of code. She had learned early that tears didn't fix problems, exploiting systems did. "You're losing 14% of your port shipments to the Lotus," she stated, her voice steady and pitching just above the hum of the air conditioning. The tailor froze, a silver pin hovering inches from Lee's leg. "My brother fixed a water-damaged rig for them," Ayanna Davis continued, unblinking. "He saw their master ledger, encrypted it, and hid the drive with me before they kicked our door in and took him." She held up the drive, her eyes locking onto Lee's. "This is their entire empire. I have the dynamic encryption key locked in my head. You want your ports back? You get my brother back." Welcome back to the gallery. Stay with me till the end. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from, and you're absolutely amazing. Let's get into the story. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. This wasn't a desperate rescue mission. As the most dangerous man in the city stared down at a child forced to grow up far too fast, he realized he was being offered a hostile takeover. The silence in the tailor shop stretched, brittle and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Tae-young Lee looked down at the small plastic rectangle in Ayanna's extended hand, his expression an unreadable mask of corporate detachment. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he stepped off the velvet pedestal, waving the tailor away with a flick of his fingers. The elderly man practically vanished into the back room, leaving Lee, his 3 guards, and the 10-year-old girl standing in the center of the Persian rug. Lee finally took the drive, its casing cold against his palm, and walked toward a heavy mahogany desk nestled in the corner of the room. He bypassed his primary workstation, pulling a sleek, air-gapped terminal from a locked drawer, a machine entirely disconnected from Nebula's logistics mainframes. He slid the drive into the port. The screen flared to life, casting a stark blue glow over Lee's sharp features. Lines of aggressive, proprietary code immediately flooded the monitor, a digital fortress designed by the Golden Lotus to protect their lifeblood. Lee's fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed that betrayed his polished boardroom exterior, attempting a brute force bypass. The screen flashed red. Access denied. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he turned his gaze back to Ayanna. She hadn't moved an inch. She stood amidst the luxury of the shop with her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her oversized jacket, watching him with an unsettling, patient calm. He tried to press her, letting his voice drop an octave to the cold, lethal pitch he once used to break men on the rain-slicked streets of the East End. He warned her that children who played games with syndicates usually ended up as statistics, testing her resolve, searching for the crack in her armor where a terrified little girl might be hiding. But Ayanna just watched him, unimpressed by the theater of intimidation. She explained with chilling precision the architecture of the dynamic encryption. She didn't speak with the rehearsed cadence of a child repeating what she'd been told. She spoke with the deep, innate understanding of someone who had been raised on motherboards instead of bedtime stories. After her parents died, her brother Marcus hadn't just protected her in the cramped back room of his repair shop, he had armed her. He had taught her how systems worked, how to find the vulnerabilities in complex networks, and most importantly, how to encrypt data so thoroughly that even a billionaire's cyber team would burn out trying to crack it. Listening to her detail the fail-safes she and Marcus had coded into the drive, Lee felt a strange, unfamiliar shift in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was a useless currency in his world. It was a profound, echoing respect. He recognized the hardened pragmatism in her dark eyes, the same ruthless calculation he had been forced to adopt when he was clawing his way out of the city's poorest districts. She wasn't asking him to be a hero, she was offering him the blade to cut the throat of his greatest rival. The Golden Lotus had grown arrogant, relying on old-school violence and intimidation, completely blind to the fact that their absolute destruction was currently standing in a bespoke tailor shop wearing scuffed yellow sneakers. Lee closed the laptop with a soft, decisive click. He looked at Ayanna Davis, no longer seeing a child, but the most dangerous asset in the city. He told his lead security contractor to prepare the penthouse, acknowledging for the first time that the terms of the hostile takeover had been accepted. The neon sign outside the East End repair shop flickered with a dying, erratic pulse, casting sickly violet shadows across the cramped back room where Marcus was slowly going blind, staring at a microscope. At 22, his eyes were already lined with the permanent exhaustion of a man carrying the weight of 2 lives. The heater had died 3 days ago, leaving the air biting and metallic, but Marcus couldn't afford the replacement parts. He had sacrificed scholarships and his own future the day their parents died, choosing instead to raise his little sister in this graveyard of scavenged motherboards and tangled copper wire. Ayanna was asleep on a makeshift cot in the corner, bundled in 3 blankets, clutching a modified tablet Marcus had built for her instead of a teddy bear. To keep the electricity on, Marcus occasionally had to take jobs that didn't ask for receipts. That was why, when 2 men in heavy leather jackets, smelling of cheap cologne and copper, had dropped a water-damaged, military-grade laptop on his counter earlier that evening, he hadn't asked questions. He just took the envelope of cash and promised data recovery by morning. He applied a microscopic drop of flux to the damaged logic board, his hands perfectly steady despite the freezing temperature, and bridged the final corroded connection. When he booted the rigged system, bypassing the fried security protocols with a custom script he'd written in high school, he expected to find illicit betting sheets or stolen credit files. Instead, the screen bloomed with an intricate, cascading network of offshore accounts, bribed customs officials, and black market shipping manifests. It was a master ledger. Marcus leaned closer, the harsh blue light washing over his terrified face as he recognized the insignia embedded in the file hairs, the Golden Lotus. This wasn't just a burner laptop, it was the digital pulse of the city's most violent syndicate. A cold, suffocating dread settled in his chest. He knew the unwritten rules of the East End. The men weren't coming back in the morning to pay him. They were coming back to put a bullet in his head to ensure he never spoke of what he had seen. Panic threatened to choke him, but Marcus forced it down, his mind racing through the calculus of survival. He couldn't destroy the data. They would kill him for losing it. He needed leverage. Ripping a biometric thumb drive from his own workstation, he began to rapidly transfer the ledger, his fingers flying across the keys as he coded a dynamic, cascading encryption key. He locked the sequence to Ayanna Davis's thumbprint and buried the only decryption cipher in a logic puzzle he had taught her the week before. Just as the transfer hit 99%, the heavy steel door of the storefront shuddered under a massive, violent impact. The deadbolt groaned. Marcus yanked the drive from the port, his heart hammering against his ribs, and sprinted to the cot. He shook Ayanna awake, pressing the plastic rectangle into her small hand and shoving it deep into her oversized jacket. He didn't have time to explain, but he didn't need to. The sharp, terrifying intelligence in her 10-year-old eyes told him she understood. The storefront door gave way with a deafening crash. Marcus pointed to the narrow ventilation grate at the back of the room, whispering a fierce, final command for her to run and never look back. As heavy boots stormed into the shop, Marcus turned away from his sister, grabbing a heavy wrench from his desk and stepping forward into the shadows to buy her the only thing he had left to give: time. The private elevator hummed silently as it ascended 80 floors above the financial district, carrying Taeyong Lee and the 10-year-old architect of his impending war. When the polished steel doors parted, they stepped into a sprawling penthouse where floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a glittering metropolis that Lee essentially owned. Ayanna didn't marvel at the panoramic skyline or the stark, minimalist luxury of the space. Her dark eyes immediately tracked the placement of the biometric security cameras and the thickness of the reinforced glass. She moved with the cautious, calculating steps of a survivor entering a new ecosystem. Lee bypassed the plush living quarters entirely, leading her down a corridor to the true nerve center of Nebla's logistics, a subterranean Faraday-caged command room hidden deep within the building's core. He engaged a series of encrypted communication lines, and within the hour the room began to fill. They weren't the muscle-bound thugs or heavily tattooed enforcers typical of the city's syndicates. They were senior corporate analysts in sharp, tailored suits, cyber warfare specialists clutching heavily modified tablets, and the quiet, lethal operators of his Ghost Squad tactical unit. This was the empire Lee had built from the bloody ashes of his 20s. Back when his hands were permanently bruised and his daily survival depended on how hard he could swing a lead pipe in the rain-slicked alleys of the East End, he had experienced a profound, defining epiphany. Violence was a blunt, messy instrument that inevitably drew the police and led to an early grave. True power wasn't about breaking a man's bones, it was about controlling his supply chain. He had spent the next decade systematically scrubbing his criminal record, educating himself in high-level finance, and forging Nebla's logistics. He traded street corners for server farms, building a legitimate, unassailable facade that secretly dictated the city's underground economy through algorithms, data monopolies, and tactical logistics. He had become a ghost who ruled through screens rather than fear. Standing at the head of the long obsidian table, surrounded by his hybrid team of tacticians and data scientists, Lee watched as Ayana was given an isolated terminal. She looked incredibly small against the massive holographic displays projecting the city's grid, yet she commanded the room's absolute attention. As her small fingers began flying across the keyboard, translating the complex network architecture her brother had taught her into actionable intelligence, the sheer scale of the Golden Lotus's vulnerability became visible. She was handing him the ultimate virus, the precise digital key required to dismantle Silas Vane's archaic, brutal empire without initiating a messy street war. As his top analysts watched the 10-year-old systematically map out the rival syndicate's offshore accounts and blind spots, Lee felt a familiar, cold thrill creeping into his chest, the predatory anticipation of a hunt he hadn't engaged in for years. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his most trusted operatives, and gave a single sharp nod. The board was officially assembled, the pieces were in motion, and the city's most untouchable CEO was finally preparing to wage a very modern war. Across the city, far from the sterile, high-altitude quiet of Neble's logistics, the air inside the Golden Lotus's primary warehouse was thick with the suffocating stench of cheap cigar smoke, damp concrete, and the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. Silas Vane paced the length of the dimly lit interrogation room, a man who wore his inherited power like a suffocatingly tight silk suit. Born into a legacy crime family that had ruled the city's docks for 3 generations, Vane was a creature of the old world. He didn't understand the invisible, sweeping power of algorithms or cascading firewalls. He understood the undeniable, visceral authority of a shattered kneecap and the primal currency of fear. To him, an empire was built and maintained through intimidation, broken bones, and territorial wars, and he viewed the modern, digitized underworld with a dangerous cocktail of ignorance and disdain. Bound to a heavy steel chair in the center of the room, Marcus was a brutalized testament to that archaic philosophy. The 22-year-old hardware genius, who had spent his life shielding his sister from this exact darkness, was barely conscious. His face was a swollen canvas of bruises, his breath rattling violently in his chest with every agonizing inhale. In the corner of the room, a terrified syndicate lackey hunched over a folding table, frantically running diagnostics on the water-damaged laptop Marcus had been paid to fix. When the lackey finally spoke, his voice trembled, confirming Vane's absolute worst fear: the master ledger, the comprehensive digital map containing every offshore account, bribed customs official, and illegal shipping manifest the Golden Lotus possessed, had been entirely ripped from the drive just moments before the door was kicked in. Vane stopped pacing. The heavy gold rings on his fingers caught the dim overhead light as he backhanded Marcus across the jaw, demanding the location of the copied data. Marcus merely spat blood onto the cracked concrete, his silence a desperate, defiant shield meant to buy his sister as much distance as possible. But Vane, despite his technological ignorance, was a seasoned predator who knew how to hunt in the gutters of the East End. It didn't take long for his lieutenants to return from tossing Marcus's ransacked repair shop. They dropped a shattered biometric drive casing onto the table, right next to a cracked, framed photograph of a young black girl with bright, calculating eyes. When Vane realized that a 10-year-old child had walked out into the freezing rain, carrying his entire criminal legacy in her oversized pocket, he didn't feel a shred of panic. He felt deeply, personally insulted. He let out a harsh, grating laugh that echoed off the damp warehouse walls, viewing the situation not as a catastrophic security breach, but as an embarrassing nuisance. Operating strictly on the outdated rules of street-level violence, Vane made the final, fatal miscalculation of his reign. He dispatched a crew of his most ruthless enforcers with a dismissive wave of his hand, ordering them to scour the slums, grab the crying girl, and bring his property back before sunrise. He fatally underestimated both the terrifying speed of the digital age and the child holding the key. Vane saw Ayanna merely as a helpless loose end wandering the alleys, completely and entirely unaware that she was currently sitting in a heavily fortified, Faraday-caged penthouse, allied with the city's most lethal architect, preparing to erase the Golden Lotus from existence with a single keystroke. High above the sprawling grid of the city, the atmosphere inside the Nebula's logistics penthouse was a jarring collision of absolute, sterile luxury and the uneasy presence of a child who didn't belong in it. The tactical strike was being meticulously plotted in the subterranean command center, but upstairs, the pacing had shifted into a tense, quiet domesticity that left Tae-young Lee entirely out of his depth. He was a man who navigated hostile corporate takeovers and shadow syndicate wars with surgical precision, yet he found himself staring blankly at his pristine, minimalist living room, completely unsure of what to do with the 10-year-old girl sitting rigidly on the edge of his imported Italian sofa. Assuming she required the standard pacifications of childhood, Lee had stiffly instructed his executive assistant to procure a selection of premium toys and queue up animated films on the massive wall-mounted display. When a silver tray bearing a plush bear and a bowl of artisan chocolates was placed gently on the glass coffee table, Ayanna didn't even blink at it. She sat with her scuffed yellow sneakers hovering inches above the plush rug, her oversized jacket pulled tightly around her small frame like armor, watching the brightly colored cartoons play on the screen with an expression of profound, unamused detachment. The silence stretched until Lee, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of sparkling water, finally sighed, the sharp lines of his face softening ever so slightly. He picked up the remote and killed the screen, plunging the room back into the quiet hum of the climate control. Ayanna Davis immediately looked up, her dark, calculating eyes meeting his. She didn't ask for the cartoons back. Instead, she extended a small hand and demanded a secure, air-gapped tablet. She explained with that same chilling, pragmatic cadence that she needed to compile the secondary firewall bypass codes her brother had taught her before the tactical team initiated the breach. Lee hesitated for only a fraction of a second before retrieving a heavily encrypted device from his study and handing it over. As she immediately set to work, her fingers flying across the digital keyboard with practiced, rhythmic speed, the awkward tension in the room began to dissolve into a strange, shared language of competence. Watching her, Lee's cold corporate detachment finally began to crack. He didn't see a helpless victim needing a savior. He saw the undeniable, heartbreaking evidence of a 22-year-old brother's desperate love. Marcus hadn't just protected Ayanna, he had meticulously armed her mind, ensuring she could survive in a world that devoured the weak. For the first time in over a decade, Lee felt a fierce, protective instinct that had nothing to do with territorial control or profit margins. And as Ayanna worked, stealing quick, sidelong glances at the towering, impeccably dressed billionaire who was silently ensuring her safety, the heavy, exhausting burden she had carried since her parents died began to shift. She had spent her entire life having to be the adult in the room, but as she watched Lee review tactical schematics with lethal, unshakable confidence, a profound realization settled over her. She didn't have to fight this war alone. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that someone else was finally strong enough to protect her, and more importantly, strong enough to bring her brother home. The digital breadcrumbs had been meticulously scattered by Ayana's small, rapid hands, creating a flawless trail of phantom IP addresses and spoofed location pings that led far away from the glittering heights of the Nebla's penthouse. Following the lure exactly as Lee had predicted, two heavily armored black SUVs tore through the freezing rain, violently breaching the chain-link gates of a decommissioned shipping yard on the desolate edge of the industrial district. Silas Vane's enforcers piled out, their boots slamming against the oil-stained concrete as they racked the slides of their cheap, untraceable assault rifles. They moved with the loud, arrogant swagger of men who expected to find a terrified 10-year-old girl cowering in the dark. Instead, as the lead lieutenant kicked in the rusted steel door of the hollowed-out dispatcher's office, they found absolute, suffocating silence. The trap didn't spring with a cinematic explosion or a dramatic monologue. It snapped shut with the terrifying, synchronized precision of a surgical strike. The shadows of the warehouse simply detached themselves from the walls. Lee's elite Dosed squad dropped from the rusted catwalks and stepped out from behind rotting shipping containers, their suppressed weapons whispering a lethal, muted cadence. In less than 10 seconds, the archaic, brute force muscle of the Golden Lotus was systematically dismantled, leaving only the lead lieutenant alive, pinned face down against the freezing floor with a knee planted firmly between his shoulder blades. From the deepest shadows of the warehouse, Taeyong Lee emerged. The meticulous, tailored CEO of the financial district was gone, entirely replaced by the brutal, calculating ghost of the East End. He had shed his charcoal wool jacket, the sleeves of his dark dress shirt rolled up to his forearms, his expression stripped of all corporate diplomacy. He walked slowly toward the pinned lieutenant, the sound of his measured footsteps echoing like a metronome in the cavernous space. The enforcer, spitting blood onto the concrete, let out a wet, desperate laugh, still clinging to the delusion that the man approaching him was just a soft billionaire hiding behind expensive mercenaries. He taunted Lee, promising that Vane would drown the city in blood to get the ledger back. Lee didn't argue. He simply crouched down, his dark eyes entirely devoid of humanity, and dismissed the tactical operative holding the man down with a flick of his wrist. When Lee spoke, his voice had dropped an octave, scraping the bottom of the register in a gravelly, lethal whisper that the city hadn't heard in over a decade. He didn't ask for the location of the black site where Marcus was being held. He simply began to explain the precise physiological mechanics of what he was about to do to the man's joints, one by one, if the coordinates weren't provided in the next 3 seconds. He wasn't bluffing, and the sheer, radiating violence rolling off him shattered the lieutenant's bravado instantly. The enforcer looked into Lee's eyes and realized with sudden, horrifying clarity that he wasn't looking at a businessman. He was staring at the dragon of the underworld, a predator who had merely been hibernating behind mahogany desks and stock portfolios. Under the crushing, terrifying weight of Lee's grip, the lieutenant broke, frantically choking out the address of an abandoned meatpacking plant on the south side. Lee stood up, his face an emotionless mask, and wiped a single drop of the enforcer's blood from his cuff. He tapped the secure comms unit in his ear, relaying the coordinates back to the subterranean command center, his voice perfectly steady. The waiting game was over. It was time to tear Silas Vane's empire to the ground. The subterranean command center beneath Nebla's logistics plunged into a state of hyper-focused silence as the digital clock on the primary display hit midnight. The time for tactical positioning and quiet preparation had evaporated, replaced by the imminent, electrifying reality of a full-scale cyber siege. At the center of the obsidian table, dwarfed by the glowing holographic displays and the towering suit-clad analysts surrounding her, Ayana sat, with her hands hovering over her isolated terminal. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, pulling up the complex, cascading logic puzzle her brother Marcus had ingrained in her memory during those freezing nights in the East End repair shop. It wasn't just a password. It was a living, breathing algorithm that required a specific, rhythmic sequence of keystrokes to unlock. When she opened her eyes, the stoic 10-year-old vanished, entirely replaced by the prodigy her brother had forged. Her small fingers hit the keys in a rapid, unbroken cadence, inputting the first half of the dynamic encryption key. The massive screens lining the room instantly flared from a dormant, defensive blue to an aggressive, piercing crimson. The cipher was accepted. Lee's lead cyber warfare specialist, a man who traded in sovereign secrets rather than street gossip, gave a single sharp nod. The digital breach of the Golden Lotus mainframe was initiated silently, but its devastation was absolute and immediate. They didn't target Vane's foot soldiers or his physical armories. They went straight for the arteries of his empire. Within seconds, the proprietary code Ayana had unlocked began systematically tearing down the rival syndicate's firewalls. On the main monitor, the room watched as Vane's meticulously hidden offshore accounts, the financial lifeblood that paid his enforcers and bribed his customs officials, began to hemorrhage. Millions of dollars were frozen, encrypted, and ruthlessly rerouted into untraceable ghost accounts established by Nebla's logistics. The old-world crime boss, who believed power only flowed from the barrel of a gun, was being bled dry by a child pressing buttons on a keyboard. Across the city, the invisible shockwaves of the attack triggered absolute, uncontrollable panic within the Golden Lotus ranks. Secure phones began ringing incessantly in Vane's damp warehouses and illicit shipping hubs as lieutenants realized their payrolls had vanished and their supply chains were completely exposed. Illegal shipping manifests were automatically forwarded to federal law enforcement databases, effectively severing Vane's logistical capabilities in real time. The archaic muscle of the syndicate scrambled in the dark, entirely unequipped to fight an enemy they couldn't physically punch or intimidate. Lee stood perfectly still at the head of the table, his dark eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the monitors, watching the digital map of his enemy's territory collapse sector by sector. He felt the cold, familiar thrill of absolute victory, an echoing reminder of his violent past on the streets, but elevated to a devastating, modern scale. He looked down at Ayana, who was still monitoring the cascading data streams with unblinking, unwavering focus. He knew that the first phase of the hostile takeover was a flawless execution. The digital walls had fallen without a single shot fired, leaving Silas Vane completely blind, entirely broke, and desperately vulnerable to the physical strike team that was already hurtling through the rain toward his doorstep. The torrential rain on the south side of the city did little to wash away the cloying smell of rust and decay surrounding the abandoned meatpacking plant. While Silas Vane's financial empire was being silently eviscerated in the sterile warmth of the Nebla's logistics penthouse, the physical reality of his collapse was about to violently breach the heavy steel doors of his stronghold. The Golden Lotus enforcers guarding the perimeter were already in a state of fractured panic, their burner phones buzzing frantically with hysterical reports of frozen accounts and severed supply lines. Distracted by the invisible, bleeding wounds of their syndicate, they never saw the shadows detach from the freezing downpour. Tae-Young Lee did not remain in his boardroom to watch the victory unfold on a holographic display. He had shed his bespoke tailoring for the matte black utility of tactical armor, the heavy weight of a suppressed submachine gun resting familiarly against his shoulder. He moved through the flooded alleyways not as a billionaire CEO, but as the ghost of the East End, his lethal instincts perfectly synchronized with the 6 elite operators stacking up behind him. At a sharp, silent hand signal from Lee, the breach was initiated. There were no dramatic explosions or shouted warnings. The tactical team simply dissolved the plant's perimeter defenses with terrifying, suppressed efficiency. Thermal optics cut through the pitch-black corridors, allowing Lee and his men to navigate the labyrinth of rusted meat hooks and peeling tile with absolute predatory advantage. They moved like a single, devastating organism, dropping panicked Golden Lotus thugs before the men could even unholster their weapons. Lee took the point position, his movements a flawless marriage of the brutal, close-quarters violence of his youth and the cold, technological supremacy of his present. When a desperate enforcer blindly fired a shotgun down a narrow hallway, Lee didn't flinch. He slipped the blast with a dancer's grim precision, closed the distance in 2 rapid strides, and neutralized the threat with a devastating strike to the throat, barely breaking his forward momentum. As they pushed deeper into the subterranean levels of the facility, the air grew thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the echoing, frantic shouts of Vane's remaining loyalists. The archaic muscle of the syndicate was utterly unequipped to handle a coordinated military strike, their brute force tactics crumbling against the disciplined, silent wave of nebulous operators. Lee's mind was a vault of singular focus, his heart rate steady despite the chaotic ballet of gunfire and shattering concrete around him. He wasn't just clearing rooms, he was hunting. Every fallen guard and breached corridor brought him closer to the center of the rot, closer to the holding cell where Marcus was bleeding for a sister who was currently watching this entire facility fall from 80 stories above. Pausing outside a heavy, reinforced vault door at the end of the lowest corridor, Lee checked his weapon, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He knew what lay on the other side. Silas Vane, cornered, broken, and stripped of his digital empire, was about to realize that the architect of his destruction hadn't just sent an algorithm to do his dirty work, he had brought the execution down himself. The heavy steel vault door at the end of the subterranean corridor didn't just swing open, it buckled inward with a deafening metallic shriek as the breaching charge detonated. Smoke and pulverized concrete flooded the cramped, windowless holding room, but the tactical optics of Lee's visor cut cleanly through the dust. In the center of the room, bound to a reinforced chair and bleeding heavily from hours of brutal interrogation, was Marcus. Standing directly behind him, clutching a heavy-caliber revolver with trembling, gold-ringed fingers, was Silas Vane. The old-world crime boss looked like a man who had just watched his entire reality fracture. His bespoke silk suit was stained with sweat and ash, his secure phone lay shattered on the floor, and the terrifying realization that his inherited empire had been completely erased by a child's algorithm had finally settled into his panicked eyes. He had nothing left, no offshore accounts, no loyal army, no legacy to pass down. All he had remaining was the bruised 22-year-old hardware genius sitting in front of him, and a petty, burning desire for a final act of spite. Vane pressed the barrel of the revolver hard against the base of Marcus's skull, shouting over the ringing echoes of the explosion. He spat venomous curses at Lee, violently rejecting the new world order that had just dismantled him, clinging desperately to the archaic belief that he could still command sheer application of a bullet. Lee stepped through the shattered doorway, the smoke parting around his matte black tactical armor. He didn't raise his suppressed submachine gun. He knew the ballistics perfectly. At this proximity, a dying twitch from Vane's finger would still end Marcus's life, instantly nullifying the entire contract he had made with the little girl anxiously watching the network streams from his penthouse. Instead, Lee let his weapon hang on its tactical sling and slowly raised his empty hands, locking his sharp, dark eyes onto Vane's. He spoke in that same cold, gravelly pitch of his youth, offering the desperate crime boss a fleeting, impossible illusion of control. He stepped deliberately into the room, drawing all of Vane's fractured, hateful attention away from the hostage and entirely onto himself. It was a lethal, hyper-calculated provocation. Vane, blinded by the sheer indignity of his total defeat and the arrogant pride of his criminal bloodline, shifted his aim for a fraction of a second, pointing the heavy revolver directly at Lee's chest. That microsecond of hesitation was the only window the architect needed. Lee lunged forward with explosive, terrifying speed, closing the distance just as the deafening roar of Vane's weapon shattered the stale air. The heavy hollow-point round slammed into the ceramic trauma plating of Lee's vest, the massive kinetic force cracking a rib and instantly stealing the breath from his lungs. But it didn't halt his forward momentum. Lee absorbed the brutal impact, violently throwing his own body between Vane and Marcus as he drove a devastating, perfectly placed strike directly into Vane's throat. The crime boss collapsed to the concrete, the revolver clattering uselessly away as he choked on his own ruined arrogance. Lee stood over him, his breath ragged, pressing a gloved hand to his fractured side as his elite operators flooded the room to secure the perimeter. He looked down at Marcus, whose swollen, disbelieving eyes stared up at the billionaire who had just taken a bullet for a street-level mechanic. Lee offered a single, sharp nod, pulling a secure comms unit from his vest. Pressing the transmitter, he spoke directly to the 80-story penthouse across the city, his voice rough but undeniably victorious, telling Ayanna that the hostile takeover was complete and her brother was finally coming home. The sterile, blinding white of the private recovery suite at the Nebla's corporate hospital was a jarring contrast to the rusted, blood-stained concrete of the meatpacking plant. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, quiet glow over the high-tech medical monitors that hummed with a steady, reassuring rhythm. Marcus lay in the center of the pristine room, his bruised face resting against pristine pillows, an IV drip feeding a cocktail of painkillers into his arm. He looked exhausted, shattered, but undeniably alive. Curled up in the oversized armchair beside his bed, completely swallowed by her oversized jacket, Ayanna was finally asleep. The terrifying, unshakable stoicism that had carried the 10-year-old through a hostile corporate takeover and a violent syndicate war had completely evaporated the moment she saw her brother breathing. For the first time since she had walked into that cedar-scented tailor shop, she looked exactly like what she was, a little girl who just wanted her family back. The heavy, soundproof door to the suite slid open with a soft hiss, and Taeyoung Lee stepped into the room. He was no longer the ghost of the East End clad in blood-spattered tactical armor. He was back in his bespoke charcoal wool suit, every inch the meticulous billionaire CEO, though he moved with a slight, deliberate stiffness, the heavy Kevlar bruising over his cracked ribs a silent testament to the price of his new empire. Silas Vane's archaic legacy had been entirely erased by dawn. Federal authorities were already seizing the freezing, empty warehouses, completely unaware of the digital siege that had orchestrated the entire collapse from an 80-story penthouse. The hostile takeover was a flawless execution, and Nebla's logistics now held a complete, unassailable monopoly over the city's ports. Lee stood at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes shifting from the sleeping prodigy to the 22-year-old mechanic who had risked everything to protect her. Marcus slowly opened his swollen eyes, meeting the gaze of the untouchable architect who had taken a bullet meant for him. There were no words exchanged, only a profound, echoing understanding between two men who had both sacrificed their youth to survive the violent currents of the city. Weeks later, the rain that perpetually slicked the streets of the financial district couldn't touch the sunlit, sprawling campus of the Nebla's logistics headquarters. Lee led Marcus, who was leaning heavily on a sleek carbon fiber cane, and Ayanna Davis down a glass-paneled corridor deep within the research and development wing. He didn't offer them a briefcase of cash or a quiet relocation package to settle the transaction. Instead, he stopped in front of a massive, frosted glass door and pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner. As the glass cleared and the doors parted, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. Spread out before them was a state-of-the-art, multi-million-dollar hardware laboratory, outfitted with the most advanced processing rigs, microscopic soldering stations, and server arrays the corporate world had to offer. It was a staggering, luminous upgrade from the freezing back room of the East End repair shop. Lee looked down at Ayanna, whose bright, calculating eyes were wide with genuine, childlike wonder. He told her, his voice entirely devoid of its usual cold detachment, that an empire built on algorithms needed architects who actually understood how systems worked. The contract was officially fulfilled, but as Lee watched the brother and sister step into their new sanctuary, the isolated billionaire realized the ultimate return on his investment. He had traded the brass knuckles of his past for a fortress of offshore wealth, but in the end, the most dangerous man in the city had finally built a family. The freezing East End repair shop was nothing more than a ghost of the past. Today, Marcus spends his mornings designing proprietary encryption hardware in a multi-million-dollar lab at Nebla's Logistics, the frantic exhaustion finally erased from his eyes. Ayanna Davis, no longer forced to carry the crushing weight of their survival, traded her scuffed yellow sneakers for the quiet confidence of a prodigy given the freedom to finally breathe. She still spends her afternoons coding, but now she does it sitting beside Taeyang Lee in his sunlit penthouse, two brilliant architects quietly watching over a city they reshaped together. Their journey is a powerful reminder that true strength is never born from brutality or the fear we instill in others. It is forged in the fires of intellect, unwavering loyalty, and the courage to protect the vulnerable. Lee learned that his greatest asset wasn't his untouchable wealth or his ruthless algorithms, but his willingness to step out of the shadows and become a shield. Sometimes the most formidable empires aren't built to conquer the world, but simply to give a fractured family a safe place to call home. To my amazing viewers, thank you for riding along on this intense journey through the shadows of the corporate underworld. Your incredible support allows me to bring these unique stories of resilience and redemption to life. If Ayanna Davis and Lee's Gambit kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled the Golden Lotus. Until next time, stay sharp.